Rahman Rahim. This is your host Zubair Akram um, with my guest Sheikh Ruzwan Muhammad. Episode 2 of what's happening in Gaza. Um, we brought you the first episode where um, basically shared the the hue and cry and the awe the world is in about what is actually happening, trying to make sense of all the events in Palestine, in Gaza Strip, where 7th of October happened, which some are equating it to 9/11, as the enormity of it probably will supersede that in terms of what the implications are going to be for the communities, Muslims, and others in that region. People are comparing it with another world war, possibly. One front being in Ukraine, the other one being in Middle East, and the proxy wars happening. But before we go on to what others could be doing, leveraging from the situation, as we tried to understand what Palestinians are going through last time in last episode, we would like to understand a bit more in depth of, did it start at 7th of October, or is there a start point that we can start from 1967, or do we start from 1948, or even a bit before that? Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Sheikh, as we speak, so the ground offense has started. The last night's reports were all the telecommunication is cut off. Electricity is now intermittent, but all the phone signals are gone. And then there are alternative methods. Some of the signals from Egypt and Jordan, they are intermittently working. So the pictures out of Gaza will possibly stop coming out, because we would not now know for some time until something changes or what is actually happening. We've seen images from Shifa Hospital. We've seen images from the streets of North, Al Jazeera and the likes, TRT, and even CNN. They're still reporting bombing north of Gaza, and people trying to move from north to south with a promise that south is slightly peaceful, but people are getting bombed there as well. In all of this, people are still trying to make sense of why did Hamas do all of this on October 7th, and how did they get away with it? Just a little bit of reflection on that.
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So in our last session, we actually took to what I think is really important, which is for the Muslim, I'm addressing the Muslim community here, and it's important to get our theology, our perspective, initial perspective, and I would say also our epistemology, which is how we verify things, information, correct. So I didn't want to get involved in the historical issues. I didn't want to get involved into the discussions around even the issue of the modus operandi of Hamas and its kind of validity as a resistance movement, its modus operandi in terms of the events of that day itself, that morning. I didn't want to get involved in any of that because I think it clouds very clearly the central issue when we're looking at this, which is to assign a theological compass for ourselves as an ummah, as a community, and make sense of this, which is going to be, it's been an extended conflict, as you know, and it will be even more extended. You're comparing it to 9/11, but there's a lot to be analysed on that. We'll do that in the third session, inshallah, the next session. But the issue here is theology, making sure that your perspective is correct. And the second thing I wanted to get across was the epistemology, in other words, verifying facts. And this is really important when you're engaging with anything, is that you have to base what you're doing and saying based upon verifiable facts, either what you know or you're surmising that you can know based upon people's track record of misinformation. And so, my own input into that last week or last session was based upon that. Simply, everything I said was based upon theology and also based upon epistemology. How do we know things? How do we know what we know? And if you don't know something, how can you make a statement about something you don't know?
There seems to be a very clear stance. For example, Scottish Labour leader, on a server yesterday, he issued a statement. Hamza Yusuf, First Minister, again has put a post out yesterday on Twitter and on Instagram where he's saying everything is cut off. He's waiting for his parents-in-law to be contacted. They're uncontactable now. Both leaders in Scotland, even in these dire situations, their own family is trapped. They condemn 7th October first, and then they move on to say what's happening in Gaza should stop. There should be a ceasefire. Why did you find it difficult to categorically condemn Hamas?
Well, the reason for that was epistemological. It's based upon fact. Until you know the full facts of something, you cannot make a blanket statement. All the information we have had pushed out through all media channels, and this is, the politicians are kind of tied in one sense because they have to address a larger constituent than just a Muslim constituent or pro-Palestinian constituent. That's clear. So they have various reasons, and I would say a type of prerogative to at least take into account a wider community effect over their statements. I think that's perfectly okay. In my own estimation of this discussion, leave aside my opinions on Hamas, which has been I've been speaking about this on the radios and in public over the last 15 years. It's very consistent. I don't believe that it's a valid political movement. In terms of its origins, we can talk about that today, but this is something related to the events themselves. Majority of what we have from the events is from IDF sources, and we have from the whole discussion about 40 beheaded bodies, front page news. Everybody's reading it. The president of the United States is reiterating it. Everybody within every single debate is just pushing it out. The reality is that we know now from Haaretz, which is a mainstream Israeli media outlet, it said that a handful of children under the age of 3 who have died in the actual onslaught itself. So when you talk about babies, to me, I understand that to be, babies in cribs. And when you look at that origin of this one story amongst many, that the origin of that is somebody, David Ben Zion. I read it once and it just stuck in my mind. David Ben Zion. He is Israeli settler, a reserve army cadet in the IDF. All of that information came from that one person, and so he is not only a settler, but he's a virulent. He wants, in the West Bank, he wants all the Palestinians wiped out. So if you look at all these kind of sources and you find that this is pushed out, the reaction of politicians and even Muslim media, social media influencers and so on and so forth, initially condemning what Hamas did, I think it's inconsistent with the epistemological requirements of stating facts, because the condemnation has to be upon every person that killed an innocent child, woman, man who's innocent, regardless of what side it's on. The condemnation has to be absolute and clear. And therefore, if you make a condemnation saying anybody who kills somebody innocent in any attack, including from Hamas or the other Palestinian organizations that were involved in this, or we know very well that there was Palestinians that went across from Gaza into the surrounding territory who were not part of the paramilitary organizations. They may have committed atrocities, but to start off a discussion by saying you condemn when you don't know what you're condemning does not make any sense. I mean, there's a concerted attempt by the Israeli government to make sure there's a very clear narrative going out here, and this narrative has been demolished. I mean, there's people who survived from the kibbutz right on the borders of Gaza. One of them, Yasmin Porat, she came up in mainstream, which is like Radio 4 for the Israeli state media. She said, look, when we were taken hostage in our houses, we were kept under human conditions, and then the IDF attacked, and they did not care who they eliminated, including hostages. Now, which means that the whole numbers game of 14,000 and the fact that we don't have a breakdown of those people in terms of whether they were combatants or not. In other words, IDF or police, security services from the Israeli side. What we know from Haaretz is that half of them were very clearly from the people that you would consider to be legitimate targets for people who are being occupied. And I made that very, very clear last week in the last session, that you cannot expect a people who have been under blockade for well over a decade to just sit back and live in a concentration camp. It's not even a prison camp. It's not even a prison, because they're innocent. And so the initial compass that I presented was a theological and epistemological compass. And once you start that, you can start the discussions. And inshallah, I'm not going to be biased in that, in being a Muslim or being pro-Palestinian. I'm not pro-Palestinian. If this was the other way around, and I saw there was a Palestinian majority, an Arab majority oppressing a Jewish minority, I would speak with the same passion, inshallah. I know that for a fact. So this is not something that I'm just kind of, it's been something that I've been ingrained into thinking about. I went, when I was in university, we had in our I think it was a second year of university, we did Arabic and Arabic literature. One of the books we did was actually by Ghassan Kanafani. He's a very famous PLO leader, but he's also he authored a number of novels, one of which is Men in this, Rijal fi Shams, which in English would be Men in the Sun. It was all about the fact that the Palestinians post 1967 were dispersed and they were humiliated in Arab lands. And, the story ends with all three of the people, the protagonists, dying in the back of a lorry, trying to get into Kuwait, and, they die. The reality is the history of this is one that's not new, because this is, when I read that in 1991, I think it was, I didn't know who Ghassan was until a couple of years ago. I found this clip. I'm going to actually play it to you. 1970 interview with him. And this is what, 1970? This is like 50 years later. And I'm going to play it. You can listen to it and you can understand exactly what's happening here.
Engage in peace talks with the Israelis.
You don't mean exactly peace talks. You mean capitulation.
Not just talk.
I haven't seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
Why not talk?
About what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
People usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what? About stop fighting what?
Well, to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
Misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights is something as essential as life itself.
That's a standard response of the resistance at that time, 1970s, all the way up until when I was in university. It was the first Intifada. It's the end of that first Intifada. It finished roughly about 1991 or 93. Now that narrative, I looked at it, and the majority of people in my class in the Arabic studies class in the university were, I would say, pro-Palestinian, but not pro-Palestinian in terms of they were Muslims. They were majority. I think there's one or two Muslims, but the majority of them, like out of 30 or so, were not Muslims, and they would have the Palestinian scarves on, and it was a thing to do. And I don't think it's worth looking at anything without a very critical mind, and that includes from a Palestinian perspective. Even if you're pro-Palestinian in this context, I think we do have to have a kind of critical mind on that. And the critical mind leads me to not condemning Hamas, as much as it wouldn't condemn a Zionist organization if they were in a similar situation. So, it's not based upon being pro-Palestinian at all.
So a critical mind makes you not condemn a Zionist organization if they were in that situation.
Absolutely not. Because why? Because truth is truth. Right. There was this Stephen Fish. He wrote a very interesting book. He's from Berkeley University, and it's all about the title. I think, off the top of my head, is "Are Muslims That Different?" or something along those lines. And in it, he does thought experiments. He says, "Imagine what Muslims are going through is what you in the West went through. What would you react to? How would you do it?" He says, "Imagine Muslims and China were in the ascendancy, and Europe, Western Europe, and America was under the yoke of Muslim nations in China, what would you do? How would you resist? The West would react in exactly the same way. When it's glorifying itself when it's in a situation like the First World War, Second World War, all the way back to all the wars they've fought, glorifying everything they've done. And then all of a sudden, if you've seen oppressed people, they forget that if they were themselves oppressed, what would they do in return? And that, I mean, that's Ilan Pape is a fantastic Israeli historian who's basically he's not been able to teach in Israel since he basically did all this research on all the documentation around 1948, which is called the Nakba. His conclusion was not based upon his opinion. He was a Zionist. You know, his parents fled from Germany. And very clearly and very slowly, he started to realize that once you look at the archival information, some of it which was released 50 years later, 1998, it was very clear that even prior to 1948, there was a concerted effort on the part of Zionists to ethnically cleanse Palestinian land. Now, that's an observer who is not committed to any side. And in fact, quote unquote, he's called a self-hating Jew. And so one of the things that means that we have to get our epistemology right is to understand that anybody who takes up arms against resistance is essentially immediately called a terrorist. Anybody who does non-violent opposition to the occupation is called what? He'll be called a militant. Anybody who speaks up, who's not a Muslim, who's a Gentile, speaks up against this situation will be called anti-Semitic. And anybody who's a Jew or who has parents, grandparents who've died in the Holocaust, who speaks up the truth will be called what? A self-hating Jew. So the propaganda here is very clear. The narrative is very clear. And in that kind of context, to come out and then just buy into the narrative and say, yes, we condemn, doesn't make any sense because you have to have a sense of proportion. And the reality is that once you've accepted the condemnation, it's very easy to say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself.
So
Meaning,
in the sound,
yes, look, if you say that Israel has the right to defend itself, that cuts both ways. It's a sword which has two sides, and the two sides are that the Palestinians had the right to defend themselves, and you could say they've defended themselves. And now all you're saying is you're flipping it to say, well, Israel has the right to defend themselves. But I would say logic still exists, epistemology still exists, and there's a sense of right and wrong. And that's the basis upon which any kind of intervention has to take place.
So where we stand in this soundbite kind of environment, where do you not condemn 7th of October? Do you not condemn the historic makeup of Hamas? Why would you not condemn? Why would you not categorically say that that kind of act is nothing to do with the Muslim mindset, desired Muslim mindset? I mean,
Zubair, if you look at what I said very, very clearly. There was two things I said. There's a theological condemnation, which is to the day of judgment upon anybody who kills somebody who's innocent, regardless of whether Hamas, regardless of whether Israeli settler, it doesn't make any difference. Because I said that in the Jewish scripture, in the Muslim scripture, whoever kills one soul is as if they've killed the whole of humanity. I would not justify the taking back of Quds if that was premised on the killing of one child. I would walk away, because that's like killing the whole of humanity. Does that mean the Quran is less important than getting some kind of liberation, some kind of piece of land?
Sheikh, I understand this being your personal disposition. Where do we start understanding the mindset? How do we begin to understand the mindset which compels people to do what they're doing and forming these organizations in the name of liberation of the sacred land, Al-Quds Sharif as it's called, and also liberating what they call is the rightful homeland?
With the mindset is the mindset of a person whose land's been taken. I mean, I was very clear last week as well in the last session that if I was in that situation, I would consider myself condemned to cowardice if I didn't react, or if that was not an option that I took. If I pulled myself out of armed resistance, that would be a intentional, difficult conversation with myself to do, because the reality is there's very little options. In fact, is there any options? I would say it's very difficult to say there are. That organization is there, and it's there for a reason, which is that has been, I mean, up until 2019, Netanyahu was buttressing up Hamas, making sure that funds were coming in from Qatar to support and allow it to survive, so that Fatah, which is the other side of the Palestinian resistance, would not be able to get a foothold in Gaza. It's very clear. I mean, this is all on record. So the reality is that, you know, the reason why Hamas came into being, you have to look at why Muslim Brotherhood came into being. You have to look at I looked at this in detail. Why are the Muslim political mindset, why is it veering towards this over the last century of resistance, of reforming, of rejuvenating some kind of Quran wa Sunnah kind of ideology? The reality is that, you know, the mindset is one of, they've been compelled, and I mentioned again in the last session, the psychological mindset of people who are under oppression is very difficult for them to wrench themselves out of that, because there's no options.
So going back to where it all started, so the timeline is not October 7, what's happening right now. The timeline is not 67, it's not even 48. I was reading up on some of the historical context, and just the formation of Palestinian flag. I would like to understand, is it not the colors of Fatimids, the Umayyads, and then there is a Jewish color in it, and then there is peace color in it, and then there is red in it, and that signifies a revolt against Ottomans, because Arabs stood against the Ottomans, hence the Palestinian flag, because the flag signifies we are not Turks, we are Arabs.
Yeah, I mean, look, the classical, I mean, Ghassan Kanafani, I just may plead him here. He would start his whole discussion, a Palestinian-focused discussion around the kind of move of Ashkenazi Jews into Palestine, and then, you know, he would trickle it down to just pre-1946, probably 1909 or something. But the reality is that, you know, the Ottoman Empire ruled over that for a large period of time. Before that, you know, there was the whole episode of the Crusades, and there was give and take. There was, you know, it was handed over to different types of people. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu took the keys from the patriarch in Jerusalem, and he entered. It's very well known, his entrance into it. And before that, the Romans they expelled the Jewish community from Jerusalem in the first century after the passing away of Prophet Isa, or the ascension of the Prophet Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. And so you could go back, and you could go back to Genesis. You could go back to Genesis, where the Prophet Ibrahim, it's promised that he will be given the land between the Nile and Euphrates. And again, we're talking about flags. You know, Yasser Arafat and a lot of the kind of propagandists of the Palestinian cause will say, well, the two lines of the Israeli flag represent the two rivers, and therefore the intention of Israel is to, you know, to conquer all the way to the Nile, to the Euphrates, you know. And so this is kind of mythical, because, you know, the Israeli flag itself was kind of came into being at the beginning of the last century, and it was very much mirrored around the Jewish prayer shawl, which has, you know, a very specific blue hue within it, which is considered to be sacred. And in fact, it's only the Ashkenazis that use this kind of coloring. The Sephardic Jews, who are kind of more Semitic, would not have a clear white robe, which they use, which is very similar. In fact, one of the reasons why some scholars in Islam consider it to be makruh to have it over your head is because they consider it to be resembling the Jewish community. You know, that white thing people wear, you know, which is now Arab, is actually Sephardic. The thing about Quds is that for us, I think in our modern mind, where I think it should start is when we see that there's a movement of people looking for a homeland who are not from that land. In other words, in living memory. Remember, the whole idea of, oh, it's in the book of Genesis, therefore it belongs to us. I mean, no one can use that as a basis of taking anything. Imagine going back to your house, and then there's some people come from Norway and say, well, we were here at this point in time. And then you can go back indefinitely in that sense. But I think it was Sultan Abdul Aziz who actually preempted the taking of Palestinian land for public ownership, because he saw this movement of Zionists into the sacred land. This was 1870 roughly. This is before Abdul Hamid II. when Abdul Hamid became the Khalifa or the Sultan, he restricted the stay of non-residents in the sacred land for only 30 days. In other words, he restricted it because he saw that land was being purchased and people were moving in. And slowly but surely, what you see is that the Ottoman Empire obviously is in debt, and then you have famous instances of the Zionist movement once it has its inception, end of the 19th century. They specifically seek out land, and the British Empire, which at this point hasn't got control of, remember, Palestine. The Ottomans are still in control. They're saying, we'll give you Uganda, we'll give you Cyprus, so these lands that they have control over. But the Zionists insisted upon, Quds. And Theodor Herzl, who was the kind of main kind of brain behind the Zionist movement, offered to pay the foreign debts of the Ottoman Empire and to argue its case in European capitals for the land that was there. And Sultan Abdul Hamid famously and heroically refused. And in fact, it was on the basis of that I consider, and most historians consider, the fall of the Ottoman Empire to take place, because they essentially the Zionists essentially incited a whole group of what are called now the Young Turks to rebel against him and dethrone him and banish him into Salonika. Salonika was one of the most populous Jewish cities in the world at the time. And in fact, a lot of, I think the first Israeli prime minister was actually from there, spoke Turkish, went to Istanbul University, I believe. And so there's the history of the Ottomans and the Palestinians and the Jewish who were essentially citizens of the Ottoman state is very, very deep. Yeah, it's very, very deep. But what's interesting for me is that we have, a number of prophecies, and I always kind of don't want to go into the prophetic kind of mindset where you kind of look at apocalyptics. But there is a hadith of, the Fitna. There's a very famous hadith, well-authenticated hadith of the Fitna, one of which is the Fitna as-Sarra. Fitna as-Sarra is the secretive Fitna, which the Prophet, prophesied would be the end of time. And, a lot of scholars at the point of the First World War, and specifically 1916, when you have Sharif Husayn essentially instigating a revolt against the Ottomans, paid for by the British in secret until we found out about it through the release of documents, we realized that the Arabs revolted. And Lawrence of Arabia, the story of Lawrence of Arabia, the revolts against the Ottomans. All the Arabs essentially revolted. And the reality is the revolt was instigated by the British. And they gave them some crumbs. Sharif Husayn was in charge of the Hijaz from 1917 to 24. He was overtaken by the Al Saud family, and up until now, the Al Saud family, the Saudi family, is in charge. But in the commentary of Abu Dawood, it's mentioned in Badr al-Majhud, it's mentioned that the Fitna as-Sarra was the fitna of Sharif Husayn, because he sided with the enemy in secret to undercut the Muslim ruler. And essentially what happened is, straight after that, you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which again is a statement that comes out, a declaration that comes out before the British have control of Quds. Because in 1918 is when the Mustafa Kemal, who's now Kemal Ataturk, he actually recommended that Muslims withdraw from Madinat al-Nawwara. He's the one that pulled out from Asham as well. And in 1918, it was when the British got the British mandate. But before that, 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was given to the Rothschilds, there was still no control of the British over that land. But the reality is, what's happening here is that you have an Arab nation undercutting what they consider to be this kind of imperial force, which is the Turks, and then being given a promise not to be given land, but to be given some kind of kingship in their small territories. So in Transjordan, in the Hijaz, in Egypt. But the reality was that was for a very specific reason, which was to carve out a piece of land for the Zionist movement. And that's exactly what happens. From 1918, when they get control of it, up until 1948, when the UN rubber stamps the partition of Palestine.
Are we saying, and is it important anyway, but are we saying Ottomans are, or the Turks are responsible partly for where we are with Palestine?
Well, if you look at you're saying the opposite. The Arabs this goes back to the whole anti-Turkish mentality in the Arab nations at the end of the 18th, 19th century. If you look at Rashid Rida, he considered the fall of the Muslim Ummah to be placed firmly at the door of the Turkic mindset. So, and he talks about the time of Mu'tasim, the Abbasid Mu'tasim, the infiltration of foreign elements, primarily Turkic warlords and warlords, you would say. And he considered that to be the fall. So even in religious discourse, Rashid Rida was a very famous, well-known scholar. Muhammad Abdu, Jamaluddin Afghani. And so the first task was to rid yourself of that. And they revolted. The Arabs revolted against the Ottomans. The basis of that revolt was not, I think, justified or justifiable. It's well known now, and people look back. But it was instigated by the French and the British. And so the Arabs were left in a very interesting situation, which is that they sided with an enemy that then took the land that they were promised to be given and carved it out under the auspices of the UN and gave it to essentially this external force, which is the Zionist movement. It's not an internal force. Anybody says the Zionist movement is an internal force doesn't know history. The Zionist movement in its inception is very clearly amongst Ashkenazi Jews in Europe.
Going back to that time and trying to capture the mindset, how is it the entire world conscience, the people who were the movers and shakers at the time, the major stakeholders, the political powers at the time, they considered this to be their duty to give this piece of land as a homeland for a small community?
Well, to understand that, you have to understand something that is very clear within European history. It's the guilt of the Gentiles. I don't know if you know the guilt. Gerald Kaufman, he's very famous. I think he was a foreign minister for the Labour Party for a period. Front bencher. He was principled. He was obviously Jewish, represented a Manchester constituents. And, he gave a speech in 2000, I believe it was 2010, 2009. And maybe 2009 because it's Gaza, again, an attack on Gaza. He gave this speech about, he gave this picture of his grandmother being shot dead by a Nazi. And he said, my grandmother did not die at the hands of a Nazi soldier to provide cover for Israeli soldiers killing Gazan or Palestinian grandmothers. And what he said after that is worth noting. So he is called a self-hating Jew. There's a whole deep psychological analysis required here that he is called, from survivors of the Holocaust. He says the present Israeli government ruthlessly and cynically exploits the guilt of Gentiles over the slaughter of Jews in the Holocaust as justification for their murder of Palestinians. Now, who's he? He's a self-hating Jew. Let's just call him what he is and let's just banish him from the annals of history. But the reality is that problem of the guilt of the Gentiles, which is, Ali Jinnah, you'll know this. He called Israel the illegitimate child of the West.
Yeah.
You know why that is. And the reality is, I would add to that there's another layer to that, which is that they refuse to acknowledge its lineage, but they will pay maintenance. So it's a very strange situation where it's almost like Donald Trump. I'm not going to say it actually, but it's kind of libelous. But you get the idea. Somebody is essentially owns up to being the father of somebody, but does not say in public, but gives maintenance.
Yeah,
there is deep guilt here amongst anti-Semitic Christendom of what they have. I'm in Istanbul. Under Bayezid II, who's a son of Sultan Mehmed I, took in all the Jewish survivors of the atrocities in Spain. When the Jews were expelled from Spain, where did they go? Where were they invited? Where were they given? To this day, there's parts of Istanbul you can go, and they're historical Jewish places where the Jewish people still live. The reality is that is a Christian problem. And the reality also is that there is anti-Semitism within the Arab nations imported from the West. The Elders of Zion was for a long period the second most popular book after the Quran in Egypt in terms of sales. Now, the reality of that is that was imported by an Arab mindset that insisted on taking on the kind of progressive empirical mindset of the Europeans also in their anti-Semitism. You know, Rashid Rida was influenced highly, and Abdu was influenced highly by Spengler. Spengler was a known anti-Semite, meaning in the true sense of the word. He felt that the Aryan race was superior, and he felt that the Semitics were anti-rational, and so on and so forth. And essentially, part of this problem is the fact that the Arabs have also, kind of sucked in some kind of deep anti-Semitic rhetoric as well, which clouds their understanding of the issue, which I'm going to talk about, inshallah, in the next session. But the reality is the complexity of this is, pointed out by the fact that there's layers of narrative here.
So the stakeholders, the emotional and the historical stakeholders, I mean, it's a lot of it is not even rational. A lot of it is emotional, it seems. So there is Western guilt, if you like, or there is a Christian guilt, a collective guilt playing. Then there is this Turkic mindset, not even just mindset, the Turkic reality of declining power and how they wanted to just hold on to the power which they were losing. And then there is this Arab nationalism, which Muslims blame the West and some of the key people that they came in and they played a role in creating a wedge and then widening the gap and weakening what was the power at the time. It is how important it is to understand these layers in depth for people who want to be on the side of kind of safeguarding human sanctity, human life, human property, and honor.
I mean, that's a fantastic question, because you want to be on that side. I mean, if I want to be on the side of the Palestinians, I just walk away now. I'm not on the side of the Palestinians. I mean, if I felt that there was within this discussion something that means that I need to change sides, I would change sides. And I've spoken to Jews. I mean, I was in 2008. I knew David Lunan, who was at that point who was moderator of the Church of Scotland. I got to know him through, we were doing stuff on climate change, and he approached me because the Church of Scotland were organising a trip to Palestine and Israel. And so, I spoke to him for a period on the trip, and they hosted us in just outside, the old city. The Church of Scotland has a hostel there. I can't remember what it is, but they have a kind of church and they have a hostel which is allied to it. So they hosted us, a group of people that we went there. And, the trip was interesting because we got to meet, the Palestinian Authority. We went around the West Bank. We also met people a couple of people from the Knesset. And so what was interesting was the Church of Scotland organised it, but there was this interesting tension when we were trying to set up the itinerary, which is who do we meet? And so it came to a fore when, there was about 2 or 3 people from the Jewish community, and they refused to meet Mustafa Barghouti. Mustafa Barghouti is a very eloquent, a very compassionate, very kind of, I would say, somebody who articulates the Palestinian cause, and he's been on the kind of news outlets quite a lot over this context. He's not part of Fatah. He left. He's not part of the Hamas, obviously. But the fact is that he's a voice, I believe, of fairness, I believe, in this context. And I remember the 3 or 4 Jewish people refused to speak to him, go in first of all. So we had a whole discussion for about half an hour. They refused to go in to see him. And then when we got in, when he started talking about the Palestinian issue, and he showed statistics and maps and realities, I could see the people in the room who were Jewish shaking and almost like faint. One of them was almost about to faint. And when I was looking, it was as if they refused to accept something which is factual. And at that point, later on we went to Hebron. Hebron is, epitomizes the worst of the settler mentality, oppressing the Palestinian people, humiliating them. And there was a settler there who was basically spouting out so much fascist, to the point that the Jewish delegation said, "Oh, we have nothing to do with this." But the reality is, the present Israeli government is basically buttressed up by these very people. So the reality is, I'm very fair in this, and I've kind of looked back on it, and I've kind of revisited it a number of times. The first time, 1990, 91, I used to read about a lot. At that time in university, it was the thing, because Intifada was going on, the first Intifada. Remember, the first Intifada led to, I would say, nowhere near, I would say much less than 3,000 deaths maximum, the first Intifada. Now look at the numbers we're talking about today. The second Intifada was much more bloody, but still we're talking about 5,000 people in the second Intifada during, up until about 2005. Still nothing compared to what we're seeing in this conflict. And so the reason I got sidetracked, your question is exactly right, because how do you make sense of it? How do you make sense of it as a person that wants to fight for the right side? Because that could be not your side.
Yeah, it's the three things mentioned in Quran: life, property, and honor. Seems to be the most important things for human life, guaranteed as the basic human right. And if these three are not, so where do you stand with this? And how important it is for us to understand these historical facts.
It is really important. Yeah, it's really important. If you look at all the historical facts, we could go to, up until 1946, the Arab nations, essentially underwrote a heresy by being so nationalistic. Jamal Abdel Nasser and, all the Ba'ath part, the two sides of the Ba'ath, all this nationalism comes out of this hatred of the other, essentially. And this sense of hubris. One of the things, if you don't understand this point, you will not understand the Arab situation. The Arab situation is full of hubris, full of this sense of entitlement, this sense of it's done because we are on truth and we sing an amazing nasheed, fighting for valor. It's this sense of arrogance, this sense of hubris, which has been part of the Arab nation over the period when they revolted against the Ottomans. I believe up until now, if you look at the 1948 war, 1967 war, 1973 war, you will see hubris. And hubris is essentially the Israeli Zionists are preparing for war. They're preparing, meaning they're practicing. And there's a whole group of people Zionists who came to Palestine to fight for the Zionist state, who have a name called Sabira. Sabira in Hebrew means prickly pear. It's like a cactus. That's actually an Arabic word. It's an Arabic word. Al-Mutanabbi, he mentions it. He says, لا تحسبن المجد تمرة أنت آكلها لن تنال البر حتى تلقي الصبرة. Sabira is like a cactus. He says you'll never, what does he say? Do not think that victory is something that you can just pluck and eat, like a date. Like a date, something sweet. You sit back. You will never achieve to victory until you chew on cactus. And it was a difficult thing. And these Zionist conscripts were called Sabira because they were ready for the war. The Arabs, on the other hand, were writing poetry about how they're going to liberate Palestine, take their land. Not Palestine at that point. Remember, the Egypts were fighting for the Gaza Strip. The Transjordan nation was fighting for the West Bank. The Syrians were fighting for the Golan Heights. And, so the Palestinian within this is an unfortunate other. It's unfortunately sidelined. And the reality is that hubris, that arrogance became very clear in every single engagement they had with the Zionist state, all the way from 1948. The UN, and I consider the UN to be established for nothing else except to rubber stamp the establishment of the State of Israel. The Balfour Declaration provided the context for a separate Jewish nation. The UN rubber stamped the partition. The day of the announcement of the which is I think May 1948, the Arab nations the same day attacked Now, the whole point here is you're attacking, but on what basis? They have some sort of basis, but no preparation. Within that war, they lose 60% of the land that was designated to them during the UN partition. Think of that. 4 Arab nations attacking the nascent Zionist state, being humiliated. And then look, on the basis of classical Islamic warfare texts, you take land by force and are victorious, it's yours. And so we've got all these things that, I'm going to talk about this in the next session, but the reality is we have parallel narratives, parallel discourses that don't make any sense as Muslims. Either we accept the establishment of nation states with international law, and that's a whole line that you have to take, or you say that we're going back to pre-classical jihad, theory, where you basically what you conquer is what you take, regardless of international statutes. So we have to decide, within which rubrics, as leaders, as organizations, as individuals, do we want to discuss this topic? Because you can't just accept something like the League of Nations or the United Nations and international charters as nation states, and then when you don't like it, you kind of fire up this hubris that you have and say, okay, we're going to take land. It doesn't work. And so this is something for next week. But the reality is that hubris, that anger, that sense of arrogance, which led to the Egyptian army being humiliated, the Syrians being humiliated, the Transjordan army being humiliated. All this humiliation is on the back of what? On the back of the fact that they know that they cannot fight.
We are coming to the end of this podcast, part 2.
Without actually talking about any of the history. We haven't talked about 1948, and I think 1948, remember, pre-1948, there was ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Palestinian land, urban land. I mean, this is well documented from archival information we have of Zionist commanders giving specific orders to clear land of Palestinians. So this is the reason why it's complicated, is that 1948 wasn't just Arabs fighting, there was actually Palestinians being forced off land. 1948, 1967, 1970, all these are important, and each of them have lessons.
But force of land wasn't automatic. This force, the enforcement, lies within the weakness of the infight, or the lack of political understanding, and or infight of nationalism, Arab, Turk.
Absolutely. Yeah, the situation that leads to Palestinians being thrown out of land before the partition is based upon exactly that. There's all these other different kind of movements within that place, and the Ottoman Empire is coming to an end. As naturally every state, as Ibn Khaldun says, history is cyclic and nations rise and fall. Ottomans rose for far longer than anyone would imagine they would rise. But the reality is, there's a large degree of introspection and reflection required on the part of Arabs.
Yes, I thought we had covered history in terms of trying to understand that it is not an automatic expulsion from a land. It is a result of your own reality, or the reality of the community. Because what I understand, the land around Al-Quds was sacred. It was a trust. You can sell, you can buy. It was there as Waqf by Ottoman.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So
80%. Sultan Abdulaziz made 80% of the land a Waqf, and what you do unfortunately find is that people usurp the land that was part of the Waqf. Essentially, the part around the Wailing Wall was a Moroccan Waqf for ulama, well known, documented in Ottoman archives. Now, the reality is, amongst the people there were people that sold their land, some people that were duped into selling their land, and there was land taken by force. But the reality is that, people do buy and sell, people do leverage and mis-sell things. And look, I was in Damascus. A lot of the Masjid al-Hanabila, which is in the north of the city, the majority of its manuscripts were sold by the bookkeeper to Orientalists for nothing. Like, he would at night fill up a camel and take it down to the center of the city and sell it to Orientalists for nothing. So the reality is that that was taking place all across the Middle East, all across the Muslim world, for what? For bread, for livelihood. And the reality is, this is why I think it's really important that we have to understand on what basis are we discussing this. Is it based upon the transparency of law, or is it on the basis of, right, might is right? And so all of these discussions, they do merge in somewhere, given the conflict and its unending nature. There is a sense of getting, the history right, or at least the history in context. And the history in context in the Palestinian issue is one where the Jewish nation has its own parallel history. They'll say, well, the reason we fought is, the maps that you have, in UN, everyone shows it, the Palestinian state, all green, and then all of a sudden there's all these things. The Palestinians have their own narrative of that. The Egyptians have their own, the Syrians have their own, the Jews have their own. I mean, the Zionist Jews have their own. It's like this idea, pre-1947, you could say, there's this thing that happened in the West Bank. There was a piece of land, a house that was taken by a settler. And he said, he was being filmed and said, if I don't steal it, who else will? That mindset is inbuilt within the Zionist, project. Pre-1947, I believe that's exactly what it was. It's still the case now. But the reality is, Israel could say 1948, we responded to an attack from Arab states. If you speak to a Zionist, that's what they will say. And that's what Netanyahu will say. Between 1948 and 1967, they will say, well, Jordan occupied the West Bank. They didn't give it to the Palestinians. Egypt occupied Gaza, didn't give it to the Palestinians. If it's Palestinian, give it back to them. And then the 1967 war, again, that's preemptive. The Jewish nation has to justify, the Zionist nation has to justify, but they seized the Golan Heights, they seized the West Bank, they seized Gaza, they seized the Sinai Peninsula. All these they took, decimated and humiliated the Arabs. And the reality is, from that time, everything we're talking about up until now is based upon essentially what you would say is the 1967 war and what Israel took by force. But the reality is, you can go back to 1948. But up until now, if you look at what's been given to the Palestinians in terms of peace treaties, it is actually embarrassing to even look at it. Even the Oslo Accord, which brought an end to the Second Intifada in 2005. I mean, there's nothing being given to the Palestinians. Everything is being kicked into the future. Any sense of permanent settlement, it's just a humiliation. And if you look at that, which is people say, well, the Oslo Accords and this peace, it was nothing. There's nothing being given. And so when coming back all the way back to your first question of why did you not condemn Hamas, it's because these people are being humiliated in the negotiating table and on the battlefield. And in fact, I wouldn't say in the battlefield, there's no battlefield, there's a concentration camp. And if their desperation and psychological breakdown is such that they end up doing some things that are against our sacred law, then they stand condemned on that basis. But remember, there's this whole thing of, if you go, imagine you're in court and you're guilty of something, the judge will say, okay, background reports, mental health report. There's such a thing as forensic psychiatry. If somebody does something, you look at the person's mental state. And I mean, I would say, the kind of the state of the Palestinians, their mental state, I would say, it's very difficult for people outside that to understand the day-to-day struggle of living without freedom. And the unfortunate thing here is, from the Jewish perspective, there is this thing called, this idea of the oppressed being the oppressors, which is called the pedagogy of the oppressed. There's a Brazilian philosopher and educator, Paulo Freire. He came up with this idea of the pedagogy of the oppressed, in which if you were oppressed and the Jewish nation was oppressed and has been oppressed by Christendom for the majority of its existence in Europe, he said that the oppressed cannot get out of the cycle of oppression against other people unless they actually consciously take an effort to reform that. And when I look at Zionists, I just see trauma. I see deep, deep trauma and an internal narrative which is built upon hatred and vengefulness. But the unfortunate thing, the unfortunate thing is that vengefulness is not directed to the people who actually did the act in the first place. Christendom is targeted towards people that gave them shelter, gave them hope, gave them their most successful and peaceful history. And it's those people that are now feeling the brunt of that anger and that disaffection.
Episode 3 will discuss, is there going to be an Israel in one of the states in US? Can Gaza and West Bank and all the Palestinians move to Sinai Desert and make a new Palestine, like in New York, New Orleans?
You're being sarcastic.
New York. Is that a solution, or is something that we see as a map of Palestine and governed on a human basis by an authority which is respected for human life and for honor and for property, whatever the authority is going to be that ensures this and has some influence. It is influenced by the world powers and international law. We will look into that, inshallah, in depth in next episode. Until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.